Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me where and what time you're watching? Thanks. I remember that day when my brother, Gabriel, and our cousins Victor and Carla decided to embark on an adventurous hike through the forest behind our house. We had explored it countless times as kids, but this time, we wanted to venture deeper than ever before. So we made sure to prepare thoroughly, packing canned food, drinks, flashlights for nighttime, a first aid kit, backpacks, everything we thought we'd need, as we planned to be out for several hours, maybe even long enough to camp. I took extra, care in marking the route using a map and compass. Of course, we weren't exactly the smartest group, 4 teenagers aged 15 to 17, about to explore the unknown. Being the oldest, I carried the compass and most of the supplies, including the tents and water. Gabriel was in charge of the first aid kit and flashlights, while Victor and Carla split the food between them. My cousin also had a flare gun with just one shot, but we figured that would be enough. We spent most of the day hiking without any issues, enjoying the fresh air and the sense of freedom. The sun shone brightly and the trees offered cool shade. After a while, we noticed something unusual in the distance, something sticking out from the treetops. As we got closer, we realized it was an old watchtower, probably used for detecting forest fires but abandoned for years. Seeing it, we agreed it would be the perfect spot to set up camp. By the time we reached it, the sun was beginning to set. The tower stood about 20 meters high, but there was something unsettling about it. It looked eerie and far from sturdy, yet we still decided to stay. We debated whether or not to climb it. Carla and I were eager to reach the top, but Gabriel and Victor hesitated, worried about the worn-out stairs. The steps spiraled upward without much support and looked dangerously unstable. Eventually, we decided to give it a shot. Carla and I cautiously started our ascent, placing one foot in front of the other. But when I reached about halfway up, one of the planks suddenly gave way beneath me. My leg crashed through the rotting wood, and I let out a scream as I twisted, in pain. Luckily, I managed to yank my injured leg free and carefully sat down on the steps. Hearing my cries, Gabriel and Victor hurried up the tower while Carla tried to climb back down. We were panicking, making rash decisions. Gabriel reached me first, but suddenly froze, pointing toward a nearby tree. "Hey, look at that," he said, his voice shaky. We turned our heads and saw it. Someone standing by a tree, silently watching us. We couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but the figure was disturbingly thin, with long, tangled gray hair. Their clothes were filthy and torn as if they had been scavenged from a dumpster. They stood completely still, unmoving, almost like they were waiting for something. A chilling fear gripped us. Our hearts pounded in terror, unsure of what to do. Then, without warning, the figure started walking toward the stairs. That was it. We lost it. We all screamed and bolted up the tower in a blind panic. I made it, about 2/3 of the way up before glancing back. The figure was now rummaging through our backpacks at the base of the stairs. "Run!" I shouted, adrenaline surging through my veins. We scrambled desperately to open the trapdoor at the top, our hands fumbling in terror. Then the figure lifted its head, locked eyes with me, and shouted something incomprehensible. I wasn't sure if it was because of all the noise coming from above, or simply because the stranger didn't speak English, but her voice was high-pitched, leading me to assume she was a woman. I gripped my pocket knife tightly, waiting to see if she would come toward us, but she never did. Instead, she remained at the base of the stairs, calmly eating our food and stuffing the rest into her backpack. It was as if she was looting our supplies, completely indifferent to the fact that we were watching from above. Within moments, night had fully settled in, and she was still down there. We had no idea what to do. Climbing onto the platform felt like a terrible idea, yet we couldn't see well enough to risk going down either. Some might call us cowards for staying put, thinking I should have stopped hesitating and confronted her. I even considered it for a moment, but I knew the situation was too dangerous. With my injured leg and no flashlights, I wasn't about to take my chances against a potentially armed madwoman. She could have had a knife, or something even worse. The flare gun wouldn't have helped us now either. The night stretched on, endlessly. Finally, as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, we sat there stiff with fear, starving and exhausted. My foot throbbed in pain. Gabriel, Victor, and Carla had barely moved all night, trying to stay as silent as possible. To our immense relief, the figure had vanished. Slowly and cautiously, we descended the stairs, gathering what little was left of our supplies. I was still limping, but my brother and cousins helped me make it back home. Those 12 hours, from the moment I injured my leg to the second I collapsed onto the couch, kicking off my boots, felt like the longest of my life. I still had no idea who that eerie figure was or why she had been there all night. Most likely she was just a homeless person living deep in the woods. Later, we tried to figure out why the trapdoor wouldn't open. Victor suggested that maybe someone had locked it from above, but honestly, we had no idea how that could have happened. As terrifying as the experience had been, we all made it back home more or less in one piece, except for me and my sprained ankle. It wasn't until much later that a chilling thought hit me. What if my injury had actually saved us? If we had camped on the ground as planned, falling asleep unaware, what would have happened? Would the figure have crept into our camp? While we were defenseless, the thought sent a shiver down my spine. I remember it like it was yesterday, the day my parents told me we were moving to another state. I was only 10 years old and had no idea what was waiting for me. The house they chose was strange, built sometime between the 50s and 60s. Its shape was unusual, almost like a giant t-shirt. The master bedroom was in the central part, while my room was way off to the left. There were 2 living rooms separated by the kitchen. The front entrance had a stunning stained glass window that covered an entire wall, and that same wall extended partially into my parents' room. But what really grabbed my attention was a hidden pathway nestled in the gap of the t-shirt shape. I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was an odd house, no doubt. Oh, and there was also a basement. It had everything: a room for a freezer, an office, and a crawl space that was deeply unsettling. Just the thought of it sent chills down my spine. The basement stairs led to a massive cavern filled with piles of dirt and darkness, stretching endlessly. Outside in the backyard, a giant concrete slab covered what seemed to have once been a swimming pool. Even at 10, I wasn't naive. I knew this house wasn't meant for children. The strangest part? If I screamed from my room, no one on the other side of the house could hear me. That first night in our new home, I hated it. It felt like a nightmare. I was alone, scared, and completely baffled as to why my parents had chosen such an eerie place. The wind rattled my bedroom window, and the shadows cast by the dim light made me feel like I was living inside a horror movie. I curled up in bed, trying to get used to the unsettling noises and shifting shadows, but my room was freezing, so cold that I couldn't take it anymore. I ran straight to my parents' room, climbing into their bed. After a few nights of this, they had enough. They told me it was time to sleep in my own room. To help, they gave me a stuffed dog, which I named Sherlock. But even with Sherlock, the basement office terrified me. Every time I thought about it, I'd end up panicking and dashing back to my parents, clinging to them while they grew more and more frustrated. Finally, my mom put her foot down. Instead of letting me sleep in their bed, she let me sleep in a big chair near the basement door, which also led to the backyard. It wasn't exactly comforting, but it was the closest I could get to my parents without disturbing them. I stacked up a bunch of blankets and settled in. To my surprise, Sherlock and I fell asleep quickly. But at midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were coming from the basement stairs. Before I could react, the basement door creaked open. Panic surged through me, and I let out a scream so loud that my dad rushed out of his room, slamming the door shut. His face was full of irritation. "Why did you open that door? Are you trying to scare yourself?" he snapped. "I didn't open it. It opened by itself," I stammered. My mom came out to calm me down, but it didn't help much. The noises kept coming night after night. Eventually, she got rid of my blankets and took me to her room, where she stayed with me until I fell asleep. But that night I woke up again, this time to the sound of soft footsteps on the carpet. I froze, holding my breath. Then I heard whispering. My blood turned to ice. I nudged my mom, but she just turned over in her sleep. Desperate, I leaned over to my dad, whispering, "Dad." My heart pounded in my chest. And then, from the darkness, I heard it, someone whispering my name. "No," I gasped, clutching Sherlock tightly. But my parents didn't stir. My breath hitched as I felt something move under the blanket, brushing against my foot. I screamed so loud that my throat burned. Still, my parents remained completely still, breathing calmly as if nothing was happening. Then, I heard it. A deep, eerie laugh. It came from the door next to the bathroom. Slowly, the door began to open. I turned toward the bedside table, and my eyes widened in horror. The numbers on the clock started glowing, then counting backward. At first it was slow, but then the numbers flickered faster and faster. My gaze snapped to the corner of the room. And there, in the darkness, I saw them. Two cold, sunken eyes staring right at me. I couldn't see anything else, but I knew something was there. Without thinking, I leaped over my dad and bolted for the other side of the bed. But the door, our only exit, was locked. My parents had locked it to make me feel safer. Now, it was trapping me inside. I was completely stuck. Terrified, I flinched as a loud knock rattled the door. In pure desperation, I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a box or maybe a book from my dad's bedside table, ready to defend myself. I hurled the object at the window with all my strength, but instead of shattering, it bounced off, creating a loud, jarring noise. For a brief moment, that sound brought me relief, until something wrapped around my ankles and yanked me under the bed. I thrashed wildly, kicking and striking at whatever had grabbed me. My hands hit against it over and over, but it wasn't solid. It was some kind of soft, gelatinous mass that kept trying to ensnare me. Panic surged through me as I felt a sharp, stinging pain, followed by a strange, guttural snorting sound, like something gasping for air. It was as if a giant spider had tangled itself around my legs, squeezing tighter with each passing second. Desperation took over. I reached for anything within my grasp and swung blindly. Finally, my hand found something hard, and with all my might, I hurled it at the window. This time, the glass shattered instantly. The sound exploded through the room as shards rained down. At that exact moment, the thing's grip loosened just enough for me to slip free. I bolted toward the front door, stumbling in my panic. The moment I was outside, the freezing air sliced through me, chilling me to my core. But I didn't stop. I sprinted down the street, my heart hammering, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fear was unbearable. I had to make sure that thing wasn't chasing me. After that, everything became a blur. The next thing I remember is being found by my parents, curled up on a bench outside my elementary school, about 8 minutes from our house. My hair was tangled with glass shards, my body covered in cuts. I had a black eye and a broken arm. We moved out of that house as soon as possible, spending nights in a hotel while my parents packed everything up. The police believed that someone had broken the stained glass window, possibly intending to harm my parents, and that I had somehow fought them off. They didn't give me any further explanations. When I started therapy, my counselor suggested that the stress of moving had triggered something in me. He believed I had lashed out at the stained glass window because it was something concrete, something I could destroy, especially since my mom loved it so much. He theorized that my injuries were self-inflicted, the result of running in a sleepwalking state, aimlessly wandering the streets until I reached the school. But when I asked my mom about that night, she admitted she was just as unsettled. The basement door had been locked. Only my dad had the key, which was always on his nightstand. He made sure to keep it locked because he didn't want me exploring down there and making a mess. He still has no idea how that door opened. To this day, I still have nightmares about that creature with those dark, sunken eyes. its grip tightening around my ankles as it dragged me under the king-size bed. I don't understand how my parents didn't wake up to my screams. My therapist insists that it was all just a dream. But the sound of the glass shattering? That part was real. They would have heard it. They had to. About 5 years ago, when I was 16, I lived in a wooded area in western Pennsylvania. One night I was home with my younger brother while my mom was out at a party with her friends. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I suddenly heard a knock on the porch. But it wasn't a regular knock. It sounded more like a slow, deliberate tapping, as if someone was waiting for me to answer. It was coming from one of the windows. I stood still trying to listen. From the kitchen, I had a clear view of the front door and one of the front windows. All the ground floor lights were on, and outside, the darkness made it impossible to see anything beyond my own reflection. I waited for a moment, expecting to hear the noise again, but when nothing happened, I shrugged it off and turned back to the stove. About 5 minutes later, just as I had forgotten about it, the sound returned, this time from a window on the other side of the house. "Mark?" I called, assuming it was my brother playing a prank, but there was no answer. A strange feeling crept over me. I walked to the front of the house and pressed my hands against the glass to see better, but I couldn't spot anything unusual. Then I heard my brother's footsteps coming down the stairs. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a hushed voice. I raised a finger, signaling for silence. Just then, we both heard footsteps on the wooden porch floor, right next to the dining room window. "There's someone outside," I whispered, more annoyed than afraid. Looking back, we should have locked the doors and called the police. But I was young and stubborn, and more than anything, I was angry that someone was lurking around our house. My brother, more cautious, suggested it might be a distraction, but I was already making my way to the gun cabinet. I had grown up around firearms and knew how to handle them thanks to my dad. Without hesitation, I pulled out a 9mm, loaded it, and turned to my brother. "I'm going to scare him. Lock the door behind me." Before he could stop me, I stepped outside, gun in hand. At that moment, my brother flipped on the porch lights, and there he was. A thin, sickly-looking man stood about 2 or 3 meters away. He wore a hooded sweatshirt, and his icy blue eyes locked onto mine. He had been about to step onto the porch, but the moment he saw me, he turned and ran as if the devil himself were chasing him. I chased after him for a few meters before stopping, raising the gun. "Stop right there," I shouted as I fired, a warning shot into the air. As he vanished into the trees, I turned back toward the house, my pulse racing. But then my stomach dropped. At least 8 figures stood around my porch, with more scattered throughout the yard. Most were men, but I saw at least 2 women among them. They all wore dark jackets and hooded sweatshirts, appearing to be in their early 20s. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stared at me, their hands tucked into their pockets. I had no way of knowing if they were armed. Then, as if part of some strange, silent game, they began to disperse. Some jogged away while others simply walked toward the woods. For a moment, I forgot I was still holding the gun. It wasn't until I brought my hands to my face and felt its weight that I snapped out of my daze. I bolted to the front door, banging on it frantically until my brother let me inside. I had no idea how to explain what had just happened. What shook me the most was the silence. I had fired a shot into the air, yet none of them reacted. If they had been drunk or just messing around, they would have laughed, shouted, or maybe even apologized. But no, nothing. Instead, they all stared at me with an expression that wasn't fear or anger, but disappointment. It was as if I had ruined some twisted plan they had in mind, like they had expected something different to happen. And when it didn't, they simply gave up and walked away. At that moment, my brother turned on every light in the house and immediately called the police. To their credit, they arrived within 10 minutes and began searching the area. There were footprints everywhere, scattered all around the house. They asked us repeatedly if we had been hosting a party, but I told them the truth. More than a dozen strangers had been lurking outside in the dark. Even then, the officers didn't seem too concerned. They kept asking if we had been directly threatened, and the truth was we hadn't. not in any obvious way. No one had spoken. No one had made a demand. They had just stood there, watching. When I admitted that I had fired a shot, they confiscated my gun. But after some questioning, they eventually returned it. To this day, I have no idea what those people were doing outside our house that night. My brother has a theory that they were part of some kind of cult, maybe preparing for a ritual, and they saw us as potential sacrifices. I've always thought they were planning a break-in, but when they saw the gun, they backed off. What I still can't wrap my head around is how eerily quiet they were. They never spoke, never reacted, just watched me. And then, as if receiving some unspoken signal, they all turned and left at the exact same moment. I've read stories about UFO encounters where people claim to feel mesmerized by strange lights, only to wake up in unfamiliar places with no memory of what happened. That's exactly how I felt, like those people were under some kind of trance. That group never came back, and I've never seen any of them around town since. But after that night, we decided we needed extra security, so we got a dog, just in case. The worst nightmares often start with the simplest dreams. One moment, you're just a regular girl on vacation with your friend, and the next, you're trapped in a nightmare of blood and death. I remember my feet brushing against the branches as I struggled to make my way through the rugged, mountainous terrain. Behind me, I could hear my friends' laughter, but things were quickly taking a bad turn. "Hey, I'm pretty sure we're lost," I called out, turning to look at Emma. The sky was already darkening and the sun was slipping below the horizon. "No way, I told you we'd find our way," she replied, out of breath. Emma and I had decided to celebrate finishing university with an adventure trip to the Brazilian rainforest. It was her idea. She had always dreamed of visiting this place. She was obsessed with uncovering the mysteries of the Amazon. While on the tour, Emma had insisted we take a detour to visit some springs she had spotted on a map, which were supposedly nearby. However, our local guide had his doubts, warning us about indigenous tribes in the area that weren't exactly welcoming to tourists. But Emma didn't care. She had always been fearless and determined. "As long as they don't kill us," she joked, nudging me with her elbow. I didn't find it funny. In fact, her words made me uneasy. Still, I went along with her reckless idea, completely unaware that we were walking into the most terrifying experience of our lives. As we followed the route Emma had pointed out, I quickly realized the springs weren't as close as she had claimed. Worse, we had completely lost sight of the rest of our group. While I was worried about where they were, I was more focused on making sure Emma didn't get us into trouble. She had a tendency to get swept up in excitement and ignore potential dangers. As the darkness deepened and we still hadn't found the springs, my nerves got the best of me. "We should turn back," I insisted. "Relax, Ruth. We're almost there," she said dismissively, effortlessly hopping over a rock. "Emma, the sun is setting, and we didn't bring torches," I argued, trying to reason with her. But she was stubborn, so we kept going. After another 10 minutes without any sign of the springs, I finally had enough. I grabbed Emma's wrist and yanked her to a stop. "We have to go back. We can't keep going like this," I said firmly. She scoffed, rolling her eyes before continuing deeper into the forest. "Come on, don't be so dramatic." "We'll be fine," she assured me, leaning casually against a tree. She never finished her sentence. Out of nowhere, a net shot up from the ground, ensnaring her. Emma let out a terrified scream as she was lifted into the air. I barely had time to react before I felt something wrap around me. In an instant, I was trapped too. I screamed as loud as I could, but the sounds were swallowed by the silent forest. Suspended in the air with the sun disappearing behind the trees, we yelled desperately for help for what felt like hours. But no one came. Instead, we watched in horror as darkness consumed everything around us. Then suddenly, the rustling of leaves made me snap my head forward. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, dressed in a loincloth, his face painted. Red terror surged through me, paralyzing every inch of my body. My mouth opened to scream, but before I could make a sound, he raised a strange-looking gun and aimed it directly at my forehead. My heart pounded like a drum, and before I could even comprehend what was happening, darkness overtook me. Black spots clouded my vision, and as he fired another dart, everything faded to nothing. When I woke up, blood-curdling screams surrounded me, and an intense heat scorched my skin. My head throbbed painfully. Dazed and disoriented, I forced my eyes open, trying to make sense of where I was, but nothing made sense. I was trapped inside a bamboo cage. In front of me, a group of people chanted a haunting song in an unfamiliar language. My mind raced, desperately trying to process the scene before me. What the hell is going on, I thought, panic gripping me. But there were no answers. Only terror, only confusion. Panic was beginning to take hold. A group of men and women danced wildly around the fire, their voices rising in eerie chants. My breathing quickened as I scanned my surroundings in desperation. Then my eyes landed on Emma. She was lying motionless in the corner of the cage. Heart pounding, I crawled over and shook her gently, trying to wake her up. But the moment my fingers brushed against her skin, a cold dread sank into my chest. Her neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, and blood trickled down from her head, soaking the dirt beneath her. Tears welled up in my eyes as the horrifying reality hit me. Emma was gone. I choked on a sob, my mind racing as I realized what was happening. These people had taken us, and now they were performing some kind of macabre ritual. Then, from the far end of the cage, I heard a voice whispering my name. But before I could turn, the deafening screams from outside pierced my ears. My body stiffened as I watched the men shift away from the fire. One of them had a massive bone piercing through his nose, and when he turned toward me, a sinister grin spread across his face. A chill ran down my spine. I barely had time to process when I saw another captive being dragged out of a nearby cage. My stomach churned as I noticed the large stone slab near the fire, the place where they were taking him. Horror gripped me as they lifted the man onto the slab, tying him down as he thrashed in terror. He screamed for mercy, but they silenced him with a filthy cloth stuffed into his mouth. My body refused to move as the leader, the man with the bone through his nose, stepped forward, wielding a massive machete. In one swift, brutal motion, he sliced the captive's wrists. My heart stopped. The man let out a muffled, agonized cry, his body writhing in pain as blood poured from his wounds, staining the ground beneath him. The tribe erupted into song, their voices rising in a haunting tribal melody. Drummers pounded out a chilling rhythm while the women cheered and clapped. Then, the leader raised his machete again. Before I could even process what was happening, he brought it down on the man's neck. A sickening crack split the air. The dying man's screams ended instantly as his head was severed. The leader lifted it high, shouting something in a language I couldn't understand. Words I later learned meant sacrifice to the gods. Then, with a disturbing sense of ceremony, he hurled the head into the fire. I watched in stunned silence as the flames consumed it. Then, suddenly, all eyes turned toward me. Terror surged through my veins as I pressed myself against the back of the cage. But there was nowhere to run. The door creaked open, and two men stormed in, grabbing me roughly. I screamed, kicking and thrashing as they dragged me toward the slab. Tears streamed down my face, my sobs choking me, but my struggles were useless. They were too strong. They tied me down, just as they had the last man, and shoved a disgusting blood-stained cloth into my mouth. This was it. But before the machete could fall, a sudden gunshot echoed through the air. Everyone froze. Murmurs of alarm rippled through the group as they turned to one another in confusion. Another shot rang out, and then, without hesitation, they all scattered, vanishing into the dense jungle. Moments later, at least 10 uniformed men emerged from the trees. Relief flooded through me as I spotted our tour guide at the front. He rushed to my side, quickly untying the ropes that bound me. "Where's Emma?" he asked urgently. A lump formed in my throat as I pointed to where her lifeless body lay. His expression darkened, and he let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "We didn't find you in time." The next day, back at the camp, we cremated Emma's body before returning home to give her ashes to her family. That experience changed me forever. To this day, it remains the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I've never had a close family. My mother left years ago, and my father was always lost in the depths of his own madness, drifting in and out of psychiatric hospitals, until he finally decided to end it all. The only relative I have left is my uncle, but I barely consider him family. Ever since my father died, he's been a master of isolation, something I learned from one of my dad's cousins. Apparently, he blames himself for my father's death. I never really knew why, and no one ever gave me details either. What I do know is that he built a log cabin deep in the forests of Maine and cut off all ties with the family, living as a complete hermit. I had only a vague idea of where his cabin was, but since I'd never had any contact with him, he was as good as dead to me, just like my parents. Besides, I blamed him for my father's death. Not because I had any real reason, but because directing my anger at someone else made it easier to cope. It gave me some kind of twisted comfort in the middle of my miserable childhood. Despite everything, by the summer of 2016, I had managed to piece together something resembling a life in Los Angeles. I had a job as a manager at a beer bar, a small but cozy apartment, and even went on a few dates. They never led anywhere, but at least they were a distraction. For the first time, I thought I was finally leaving the past behind, and it felt great. Then a letter arrived and changed everything. It was from a lawyer in Maine, and the moment I saw the postmark, I knew it wasn't good news. The letter basically said my uncle had died and had left me something in his will. I never thought. He had much money, and I was right. But that didn't mean he hadn't left something behind. Still, the idea of traveling all the way to Augusta just to find out annoyed me. So I called the lawyer's office, lied a little, told him I was too busy to make the trip, and asked what exactly my uncle had left me. His response caught me off guard. He said my uncle had left me only one thing, a key to a safety deposit box at a bank in Augusta. His job was simply to unlock it and determine what was inside. The lawyer himself didn't even know what was in it. But one thing was certain, his payment was inside that very box. It all sounded like the plot of a bad thriller. But when he assured me he was serious, I started to think there was more to this than it seemed. Part of me wanted nothing to do with it. Digging into the past would only reopen wounds I had fought so hard to close. But if there was money involved, I needed to know what it was about. So I took a couple of days off that June and made the long 7.5-hour drive to Augusta, Maine. The trip itself was pleasant, the views were stunning, but the knot in my stomach never went away. By the time I arrived at the lawyer's office, I was on the verge of a panic attack. Something about this felt like it could unravel all the progress I had made in recent years. And I was right. After meeting with the lawyer, we headed to Bangor Savings Bank to open the mysterious deposit box. The bank manager led us to a secure room where the boxes were kept. My hands were clammy as he handed me the key. With a deep breath, I unlocked the box. Inside, there was nothing but a pile of banknotes and a single letter. For a moment, my worst fear flashed before me, that the lawyer would take the money and leave me to deal with whatever mess my uncle had left behind. But as he started reading the letter, his expression shifted. It wasn't a long note, no apology, no explanation. Just a set of numbers and 2 scribbled words, "Burn it all." The lawyer was completely bewildered. He asked if I knew what the numbers meant, but I had no clue. A quick Google search, however, changed everything. The numbers pointed to a location in the Vasconic Lakes wilderness area. I had a gut feeling this was the location of my uncle's hidden cabin. But I had no idea what he wanted me to burn, or why he had trusted me to do it. I was left with nothing but a puzzle, and for some reason my uncle wanted me to put the pieces together on my own. I didn't know what to do. The uneasy feeling kept growing, warning me that this could only lead to trouble. But at the same time, something deep inside urged me to follow the path laid out by that letter. Sometimes, life forces you to confront the shadows, even when the light feels impossibly far away. A strange restlessness stirred within me, and I braced myself for whatever fate had in store. In the span of 10 minutes, I went from wanting to forget all the darkness surrounding me to being consumed by a grim curiosity. I couldn't stop imagining what my uncle had been involved in during his final years. Maybe something dangerous, maybe something morally questionable. My mind drifted to absurd, yet horrifying possibilities. Dead bodies buried in the backyard, or hostages hidden in the basement. If he had left something terrible behind, I needed to find out. During my trip with the lawyer, I took the opportunity to ask about my uncle's death. Had he been sick? Surely someone had seen the place where he lived. But the lawyer told me that my uncle had been admitted to the hospital only a week before. He died. He had arranged the safety deposit box months in advance, meaning he was the only one who had been inside that cabin for a long time. I remember asking the lawyer for advice, and I'll never forget his response. Sometimes things bury you if you don't bury them first. He was right. I didn't want to be swallowed by the past again. I had been dragged down before, and I refused to let it happen a second time. The best choice was clear. Go to the cabin, do my uncle one last favor, and burn any horrific truths he had left behind. So I decided to check into a nearby motel and leave at first light for the coordinates he had given me. The next morning, after a restless night of barely any sleep, I woke up at 2 a.m. Instead of lying in bed, I pulled up Google Maps to find the fastest route to the cabin. By dawn, I was ready to leave. I didn't think I'd need much, just a can of gasoline and a box of matches. I picked them up easily, grabbed a strong coffee, and set off for the 3-hour drive to the lakes. I drove, the words from the letter echoed in my head. Burn it all. I don't think I had ever been so consumed by a thought before. It was like holding my breath until I was on the verge of passing out. I needed to see how my uncle had lived all this time. More importantly, I needed to understand what he wanted me to destroy. But deep down, I knew stepping into that cabin might shake me in ways I wasn't prepared for. It could unearth ghosts I had spent years trying to bury. Part of me wanted to set it on fire and walk away. But another part, one I couldn't ignore, needed to uncover the truth first. Finally, I arrived at what I assumed was the area of the cabin. I pulled onto an old dirt road, parked, and began heading northwest, following the coordinates on my map. About half an hour into my hike, something strange caught my eye in the local flora. I froze when I spotted a bizarre, fleshy-looking growth, something that resembled both raw meat and a human brain. At first, I thought it was some kind of small, grotesque creature, but as I crouched down, I realized it was a fungus. I snapped a quick photo and searched online. That's when I learned it was a Gyromitra esculenta, commonly called the brain mushroom. Highly toxic, but not exactly rare in the Northeast. But that wasn't the only unsettling discovery. The next variety of mushrooms I encountered was even more disturbing. These ones looked like they had pieces of human flesh embedded in them, with droplets of vivid red liquid oozing from their caps, like they were bleeding. Another quick search revealed something equally eerie. The liquid was a natural anticoagulant, which meant that at a glance it looked exactly like blood. As I continued walking, I noticed the pattern. Near every tree, 2 or 3 of these unsettling fungi sprouted at its base. And the deeper I ventured into the forest, the more of them I found. The realization settled in. The entire forest seemed to be filled with them. It was deeply unnerving. Luckily, I had a GPS app to track my location. But as I moved forward, a creeping dread began to take hold. Something about this place felt wrong. I had no cell signal, yet somehow my GPS still worked offline. The whole situation gave me the creeps. Something was undeniably wrong with this place. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive, as if something sinister lurked all around me. My curiosity kept me moving forward, but an unsettling dread gnawed at me, warning that whatever I was about to face could haunt me for years to come. Step by step, I pressed on, wondering what else I was about to uncover. It didn't take much effort to find the cabin. I just had to follow the trail of mushrooms. But before I even saw it, I smelled it. A foul stench, thick and suffocating, filled the air like rotting meat, but with something even worse mixed in. I gagged and had to cover my mouth and nose to keep from throwing up. As I got closer, I saw that the wooden walls were completely covered in those strange fungi. Some had even spread outward, creeping along the ground like they were trying to escape. By now, the midday heat had trapped the humidity around me, making it feel like I was suffocating inside a sealed jar. My backpack, weighed down with 2 gallons of gasoline, felt like a burden I just wanted to be rid of. Now that I was finally here, all I wanted was to get this over with and leave. I pulled the fuel canister out, ready to douse the place, but then a chilling thought stopped me. What if that stench was caused by flammable gases? What if my uncle had wanted me to burn that? A single spark could ignite something volatile, maybe even blow me to pieces. The smell of decay was an unnerving mystery, and for a moment I considered just walking away. But after coming this far, how could I not take a quick look? A harmless peek wouldn't hurt, right? The entire trip had been surreal and unsettling, enough. But what truly frightened me was the uncertainty. What if my uncle had left something inside? What if I was about to stumble upon a horror I could never unsee? My hand hesitated on the door handle, but eventually, I forced myself to turn it. And then, I froze. The sight before me was beyond horrifying. The inside of the cabin was even more infested with mold than the outside. The air was thick, stifling, and reeked of something unnatural. Through the haze, my eyes landed on a massive pot sitting on the stove. My uncle had been dead for over a week, yet that pot remained, filled with something I didn't even want to imagine. In one corner, tangled coils of rubber tubing slithered across the floor like snakes, pumping out a thick vapor that I instantly knew was the source of the unbearable stench. The place looked less like a home and more like a deranged laboratory, or worse, a drug den. Scattered across the floor were old mold-covered books, and against one wall stood a chalkboard, filled with scribbled symbols and diagrams I couldn't begin to understand. My head swam. The air was toxic. I tried to focus, but dizziness overwhelmed me. My stomach twisted and I couldn't fight it anymore. I stumbled backward and threw up violently. The putrid air felt like it was warping reality itself, distorting everything around me. My vision blurred and my body pulsed with a sickening sensation, as if I were being stretched and compressed all at once. Then, I understood. I was inhaling something powerful. A drug? A hallucinogen? I didn't know, but I had to act fast. Struggling to regain control, I yanked my shirt up over my nose, using it as a makeshift mask. Then I grabbed the gasoline canister and started dousing the outer walls. I soaked everything, making sure the whole place was ready to go up in flames. With shaking hands, I struck a match and let it drop. The fire caught instantly, consuming the wood at an alarming speed. But as the flames roared to life, I heard something. A sound. It wasn't just wood cracking in the heat. It wasn't just the damp logs hissing as they burned. It was screaming. Or at least that's what it sounded like. A shrill, inhuman wail echoed from the cabin, as if the fungus itself was alive and in agony. Maybe it was just my poisoned mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the chemicals reacting to the fire. I had no idea. But in that moment, I didn't care. I stood there watching as the flames devoured every last trace of the nightmare inside. As I stared into the inferno, one question plagued me. Had this thing killed my uncle? Could it have somehow been connected to my father's death as well? It didn't matter anymore. Whatever secrets that cabin held, they were nothing but ash now. When I finally returned home, I expected relief. Instead, my thoughts remained dark, circling the horror I had left behind. I had burned the cabin down, erased its presence from the world, but it felt like its shadow still clung to me. The questions I had tried to bury refused to stay buried, and yet I had to move on. Days passed, and I wondered, had I started a forest fire with all that gasoline? Strangely, I heard nothing about it in the news. No reports, no incidents. It was as if the fire had never happened. That only deepened my suspicion that my uncle had secrets far beyond what I could comprehend. But I made a decision that day. Wasn't going to let it consume me. I had built a life for myself, a normal life. I even had a girlfriend, someone I loved, someone I wanted to build a future with. We had started talking about marriage, about family, and I'd be damned if I dragged her into the darkness that haunted my past. So I made my choice. No more questions, no more searching for answers, no more digging into secrets better left buried. The past would stay where it belonged, dead and gone, and